Okay, welcome back. I'm so excited, you guys. My team challenged me to reach out to Dr. Feifer and ask him to come on the show and talk. I was so intimidated, so nervous to do it. And I have to just say, it took me a little while to figure out like how to connect with Dr. Feifer. But obviously it worked because he's here and I'm so excited to introduce you to Dr. Steven Feifer. He is the creator of many assessments, but the one that we're going to talk about today is the FAM, or the Feifer Assessment of Mathematics. Dr. Feifer, welcome.
Thank you, Adrianne. Thank you for having me and for all of the work you and your team do for madeformath.com.
Yeah, I'm just so thrilled to have you. Seriously, excuse me if I fangirl a little bit. Like, I'm really excited. We love your assessment. And I would love to hear a little bit more about your career. Like, what led you to getting on this diagnostic train? Because when I read your bio, you've had a lot of diverse experiences in education. So what led you to making diagnostic assessments?
Wow, simple question. We'll try to answer it in under 30 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, the short answer, I started as a school psychologist assessing students for all kinds of learning disabilities, including math. And I quickly realized giving an IQ test and maybe a test of math achievement in this case, it really wasn't explaining learning very well, wasn't, uh, in my opinion, generating the kinds of interventions or the kinds of explanations I would want to share with parents and teachers, and became very frustrated very quickly. So early in my career, not knowing where any of this was going, I've always had an interest in the brain and more biological aspects of learning. So I dove into a neuropsychology program very early in my career. And that's where I had the aha moment, even though it was a program that maybe was not pediatric in nature and specific for kids. The aha moment was we treat education, psychology, and neuropsychology as three separate types of fields, but there's a path where they all to me overlap. And this concept of translational research to that how research in the neurosciences could be directly applied into a classroom, I became hooked very quickly on, and continued down that path for many years of just adding that element of neuropsychology and becoming an educational neuropsychologist to my own practice so that I could assess kids a little bit deeper and with a better explanation to parents and teachers. Well, this, to make a long story short, if that's even possible by now, this led me to do presentations. They became popular. I stumbled and bumbled my way onto the speaking circuit. I didn't know I had this hidden talent that could actually articulate and speak. I knew I could write, but never knew I could really speak. And I was doing that for many years, just talking about bridging neuropsychology with reading or with writing or with math and so forth. And that's, I want to say around 2011, so maybe 10 years ago or so, a representative from PAR, one of the bigger test publishers and companies, Psychological Assessment Resources, had attended my talk and came up to me afterwards and said, I really want to reach out and have a meeting with you and talk about possibly developing some instruments around your model of learning disabilities, which was simply, there's more than one kind. It's
Yeah.
simply that whether it's reading, writing, or math, not everybody, is the same, that you can have different types, in this case of math, different types of issues with math, and that would require different types of interventions. I didn't think that was exactly saying something that any third grade teacher didn't already know, but the concept of, hey, let's measure this, let's put an assessment out there, really came from PAR. So upon hearing that opportunity, and knowing a good opportunity when I see it, I politely turned him down. I had no interest, but
Really?
we persisted our conversation. A couple of months later, we met up again at a national conference, and I became intrigued, and I started to think, would test development be a direction I'd like to go for the second act of my career? And the more we talked, the more I just really became more intrigued, became more interested and thought this, besides presentation, besides writing, research books, whatever, this perhaps could be a way to impact the field. And an opportunity was being presented to me. I signed on the dotted line, and Adrian, my life changed forever when I did that. And the second act of my career opened up as a test developer with Park.
I love it. I have chills. I'm so grateful you ended up saying yes. My son took the FAM a couple years ago, and this was his second round of testing. I knew something was off when he was younger, but because I'm an educator, I taught him to read. So he wasn't necessarily showing up on the tests as like dyslexic. But when we fast forward to him still struggling in school, yes, he does have dyslexia, but he took the FAM and I was so excited. And the data was just so good. And we had no idea he was actually on the gifted end of it. Because his struggles with math fact recall, which is more the dyslexia, the verbal part, right, was causing in the classroom for him to just look like an average student, even though he could reason crazy well in mathematics. And so I'm super grateful to you in your assessment that it gave me something solid to look at and have a discussion with my son and say, like, look at what you can do, bud. Who knew, right? This is amazing. And it really shifted him too.
Well, that's a wonderful story and great feedback, and also speaks to, especially with math, it gets kind of slippery because you can be really good on some aspects of math and other aspects maybe not so good. And in the case of your son, that dyslexia perhaps was hiding that a little. And this was a way to uncover really some of his true talents and take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to report I ended up advocating for him to get put in like an honors level class. And he's convinced, his anxiety keeps him convinced that maybe he shouldn't be there, but he actually is really excelling. He's got those concepts down. He can reason at a high level. So I'm really grateful that you have been on this path. And I love, like, calling back to what you said earlier about how it was silos, separate, the neuropsychologists and the psychologists in education. I love that you said, like, there's more overlap that there is. One of my favorite researchers, Scott Barry Kaufman, says the same thing. He's saying that tools like that you're creating are so useful. They create awareness for the student and the teachers. And he would love to see, I know his vision someday would be that all students get it, because the amount of information you're getting and this understanding about how your brain is wired is so powerful. So when you were developing the FAM, like what were some of the challenges you came up against? I can't even imagine going from that world into the assessment world. And I can't remember which one came first. Was it your reading or your mathematics one?
The reading was released first. So when I initially signed on, it was to do both a reading and math test around the central theory that there are multiple pathways in the brain that subserve reading and multiple pathways to subserve math. These are very complex skills, and to think that, oh yeah, it's just here in the left parietal lobe, let's just address. Now, it doesn't work that way. Just like your son, you can have some really good math skills and some skills that we're struggling with. So I guess all of the measures simply come under the thinking that we want to figure out there are learning disability subtypes, and specificity in assessment, getting down to what kind of math issue a student might have, will lead to specificity of intervention, which after all, that's what an IEP is supposed to be, an individualized educational plan. One of my frustrations being in the schools for so long is I didn't see enough IEPs. I saw GEPs, generic education plans. You've read one, you've read them all. They look very similar. And what happened to the I? Well, in talking with my colleagues and many educators, it's hard to develop the I, the individual part, unless we have some assessments that can individualize this a step further. I think what's really brought and with math to the forefront is the pandemic. When you think about it, with this pandemic, some students have been out of school as much as 2 years on home instruction. And when it first, March 2020, we all kind of shut it down. Everybody was on a virtual learning till the end of the year. And then the following year, some students were in a hybrid model, some students didn't go back. So there was a great interruption to millions and millions of students in terms of their educational continuity. Some subjects are impacted more than others. In
Hmm.
my opinion, math and foreign language require the most continuity of instruction and got decimated with this
Yeah, they
pandemic.
did. Yeah.
So now we're in a position where we're seeing a lot of students with gaps in their learning. And the question is, are those gaps because they're, for lack of a better term, COVID casualty? This is what happens when our education is disrupted for these periods of time, or is this a learning disability? And I think that's what's helped because the FAM is more of a diagnostic assessment as opposed to a traditional assessment. A traditional math assessment is going to say you're on a fourth grade level, a third grade level, a fifth grade level. Great. We want to know why. So by
Hmm.
going down to the level of how you process information, if your processing looks good on the FAM, but you have a few gaps in your learning math, you probably don't have a math learning disability. We just have to clean that up. And really, with a lot of folks like yourself that can go in and work with kids. Um, but if you're low and you're scoring poorly on the FAM, then perhaps that is reflective of a math learning disability.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that assessment has subtypes. There's three of them. I would love for you to discuss a little bit about those three subtypes and what each one is about in the brain.
Sure. So, and someone might come along and say, I see 5 subtypes, or I see 6, or within your subtypes, you can divide it up more. And my response is, you're probably right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So my conception, just 3 overarching conceptual pieces here. What we're trying to get at with them are some students struggle on the procedural end of mathematics. And by procedural, uh, following a series of sequences or procedures. So once we get maybe to third, fourth, fifth grade, not early elementary, but we're sort of middle to later elementary, we're doing long division. We're doing 3-digit subtraction with
Mhm.
um, and 2 and 3-digit multiplication. We're not solving this off the top of our head. We're using paper and pencil, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. We're following a math algorithm to get there. These are the kids who struggle on that procedural end of, 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 of the uh, mathematics compared to what we have, and this is maybe more reflective of your son,
Mhm.
the verbal index on the FAM is more that automatic fact retrieval. And what we're finding is you don't need, okay, a lot of quote unquote mathematical aptitude to memorize these facts. You can do them, and oftentimes they're encouraged and reinforced by our schools. How many problems can you solve in 3
Yeah.
minutes and so forth? That almost forces us to use a verbal approach to overlearn and memorize these facts, which is, if your son had dyslexia, is speaking right to his weakness.
Mhm.
Um, because you're getting into this automatic retrieval, whether it's math or whether it's words, it doesn't matter. That's where the area perhaps with him was an issue. So we look at just automatic fact retrieval because that is processed more in a different area of the brain, more in those temporal regions, more the verbal regions. And then the third subtype is more that semantic index that you know do you and struggle with math because you just don't conceptually understand it? Now, most mere mortals, like
Mhm.
myself, or maybe I'll ask you this, Adrian. There's a certain point in time in your own math career. What was it? Was it calculus? Was it graduate level statistics? Was it algebra 2? When you walked in and you heard that first lecture and you said to yourself, okay, we're done here. That's about as far as I get it. We all hit that point where math becomes too abstract to visualize. We just don't want that to be in the second grade. And
Yeah.
that's what we're getting at with the semantic index. How well can you visualize magnitudes and amounts? Because this is what gives math its meaning. And if you cannot visualize magnitudes and amounts, math is just a bunch of abstract symbols, totally meaningless, that can be combined in a very intimidating way.
Mhm.
And it brings out the angst in all of us. So, in a way, we're trying to capture with the FAM that the procedural index, the verbal or automaticity of math, automatic fact retrieval, and then that semantic understanding, the visual spatial component to be able to conceptualize magnitudes and amounts.
Yes. Oh, you did such a great job describing those. And what I liked from the intervention side is that I could look at these indexes and go, okay, we've got some strengths here on the procedural side. So we could make a near point reference that reminds them of the steps to help support that retrieval piece if they're going to forget. So there's so many juicy pieces and parts in there that I really like from an intervention standpoint. One thing that my team was super curious about is usually you administer the FAM. It's not something that you're taking on a recurring basis, like a normal school assessment that you would do where you're trying to figure out where the grade level is. But they were kind of curious about, is there times when it would be appropriate to administer the FAM multiple times to show growth over time? Or do you find that like it's something you just revisit occasionally?
No, in fact, we specifically put in the FAM a metric called the Reliable Change Index. So you can use this on one subtest, or you can use this on a collection of subtests, or you can do it. We have, as you know, in the FAM, our screener. We have 3 subtests that serve as the screener, and that might be the appropriate way to go. And the way the Reliable Change Index works is, let's say you've given the FAM, and it's pinpointed a few areas of weakness, and you and your team are providing an intervention.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, well, are we making progress? You have to wait a minimum of 30 days. At the 30-day or longer mark, then you can go back and re-give as much or as little of the FAM as you want. I would suggest just doing the 3 subtests that make up the screener. And when you re-administer those tests, you're going to get a different score than before. You then can look right in the manual and see if the change in scores from the first administration to the second administration is large enough, then you can reliably say that difference in score is due to growth in the skill.
Mm.
But if it's not, the first time, let's say they score a 75 and the second time a 78, so a 3-point difference, and you look it up and it's 3-point difference, and it doesn't meet that threshold, then we cannot reliably say that the change in score is due to growth in the skill. It just could be a statistical fluctuation. But you can do that every 30 days by looking that up on the Reliable Change Index table.
Oh, I love that. That's so good to know. And I think that's one of the challenges, like in a school setting, if you were to use this, the school psychologist has the FAM and they're giving this data back to the teachers and reassessing. It's probably time prohibitive, like having the time to go back and reassess these kids. What advice do you have about the practicality and application of using that FAM, maybe in a school environment?
Well, it certainly is a qualification B instrument. And by qualification B, that means it absolutely is for educators. It's not just for a psychologist or a neuropsychologist. Right. It is definitely for educators to use. You can, again, if you want to just use the 3 subtests as the screener, just to track progress over time. When we screen, we're not diagnosing anybody with anything. We're just trying to get some basic levels of where you are and where we might need to focus some of our instruction. So, my goal with the FAM is certainly not just as a tool that provides a vehicle into special education. If it helps as part of that assessment, great, that's what we want. And if you go to, if you don't have a PAR iConnect account, you can certainly sign up for one totally free. Mm-hmm. And you can take your raw scores from the FAM, put it in PAR iConnect, and you can get the interpretive report writer where you're going to basically hit return. It's going to take you 90 seconds to take your raw scores from the test, put them into PAR iConnect, hit return. A 20-page report will be generated immediately. All right, skip all that stuff. Just go to the end, and that's where all the good recommendations and interventions are. So yeah, definitely for educators and parents, our hope is that helps out.
That's amazing. And I was curious too, like, I know before the pandemic, like this assessment was given traditionally in a physical environment, like you're in front of each other. How did the pandemic affect that? Did PAR end up giving guidance to people? I wasn't watching during this time, but did they have to give guidance on how to administer these assessments via Zoom or however else people were doing that during the pandemic?
Well, we did do a study with the FAR, and what we did is an equivalency study to determine if you give this measure through Zoom or through virtually, um, are you getting the same data
Oh, I
as if
love
you
that.
did it in person? And not exactly. And what we were finding is that speed, the element, a timed task, we were not quite getting equivalent scores. Now, we
Mm,
did not run that study for the FAM, but it is a point of caution for any test to just assume that we can do this virtually and get the same scores. We have to run those equivalency studies. And what we're finding is that it's the timed measures
mhm.
that are getting not a lot, but slightly different scores. And Adrian, I scratch my head and say, well, what's going on? And all I can come up with is I guess it's just harder to control that testing environment. And perhaps you run into that with so much virtual intervention. It's hard to control that environment. Does that student have their phone sitting right by the monitor, and we don't know that,
Yeah,
and we're distracted by that. So
yeah.
there's just variables we can't control.
Absolutely. And during those timed sections, it's usually them writing, right, on a piece of paper. And in the virtual environment, when you were testing that, was it writing on a screen or were they writing on physical paper, trying to keep it as similar as possible to the original test?
Yeah, so we had them writing on paper, I believe, for the FAR. Like I said, we did not run those equivalency studies for the FAM, but we were doing them for the FAR. We published a paper on that. And I know that PAR has also tried to make the materials,
Mm,
the manual, things like that, as much online as possible
mhm.
to try to keep things safe. And fingers crossed, we're post-pandemic now, but not completely. But at least schools seem to be up and running.
Yeah. Yeah, keeping that testing environment is really tricky. My oldest son had to do some testing through a professional testing center. It was fascinating how they were trying to control for it during the pandemic. I had to come in with an app downloaded on my phone, and I had to scan the room he was in, and then I had to submit pictures of his work area. It was really interesting how they were trying to control for, is this student cheating by Googling the answers on their phone or whatever it was, and what the consequences were if they discovered or felt like the student was cheating. That is such a fascinating thing to try to control for in an assessment situation. So I love
Yeah,
what you guys came up with.
and we've all sort of making the best of this virtual world in a way to keep our continuity of instruction going. And it brings me to a question I have for you and your
Mhm.
team. Um, One of the things we often see, and I'm sure you see with kids with math learning disabilities, is you see them quite often counting on their fingers. And I know teachers don't like when they count on their fingers. We see that they're screaming to us, I can't visualize magnitudes and amounts in here. I needed help here. And so many of the interventions, and I know a lot of what you do, is to provide those manipulatives, the
Mhm.
unifix cubes, the dice, the dominoes. If we can't see it in here, you have to see it and feel it out there. How much of a challenge is that for your team to provide those interventions virtually?
Yeah, it is a challenge. In fact, before the pandemic, there was features in Zoom that were missing that we really wished were there that took quite a bit of effort. Before they used to not have you didn't have the ability to share like a second camera source in the beginning. So we were really creative. We would get a phone and join as another participant to the meeting and set it up like on a document camera and show the students the manipulatives. But what was challenging is getting the students, right, to figure out how to adjust their camera so they could show us. And kids were so much better at this than the adults. They're very creative. they usually would whip their laptop to the side and kind of angle it down. And now I can see their desktop, their physical, real desktop, and their manipulatives, and they can still hear me. And so those are some of the challenges that we deal with, is just getting the kids to orient their manipulatives, because thankfully the pandemic pushed Zoom to make all sorts of features available. So now we can easily share a second camera source that shows the actual teacher's real desktop while also showing their face, because the student needs to see the teacher as well on top of that. So I'm thankful that the pandemic really pushed Zoom to make these changes that we were hoping for, to make our job a lot easier. So now it's not even a big deal. Our team can share really quickly and easily with those students. And we even find that we're doing a lot of low tech still. We're doing normal whiteboards underneath the document camera, and the student is too, because they can pick it up and show you what they're doing, because that fine motor skill with clicking on a mouse and trying to draw on the screen isn't there for some of those students. So that ability to have that whiteboard and to still do the old school way of doing it is really, really helpful for us. So we've had our workarounds. I wished I would have had more data about in-person versus online, but I just started out online from day one with this. So I don't have the luxury of that data, but I would love to explore that someday to see what the differences are. Because there definitely are moments, I think, where there's students that don't do well in this environment, where maybe their attention span is so short or distracted they can't even follow the mouse on the screen. Those kiddos should be in person for sure, but that we only run into that every once in a while. It's not common, thankfully. I love that question. Thank you for asking me about it. I remember shortly before the pandemic started, you came out with the writing assessment, which I was so excited about, because that is an underserved assessment area. I think there's a lot going on with writing. So I know that our focus is math, but I'm curious, like that assessment too, what kinds of subtypes did you put in there? What was it like to develop that assessment around writing?
It was funny because I was working on the reading and the math almost simultaneously, even though they came out in different years, and it was a huge undertaking. I wish everyone could see. I'm flattered my name is on the instrument, but the team of researchers, the team of folks I work with, and the years it takes to properly norm and develop a test. And it's 4 or 5 years in the making. So towards the end of the project, one of a dear friend and colleague at PAR had come up to me and said, well, you did reading, you did math, you know what's left. And I believe my words were something to the effect of, over my dead body, we're doing writing. But lo and behold, we did it. Yeah, I'm really proud of the assessment instrument. It looks at 3 types of writing. Is more for younger students. It tends to be more of a motoric issue. So we have a lot of motor related tasks, a lot of motor planning tasks, copying speed tasks. Is your problem with dysgraphia? It's a very broad term, more on the motor end of things. That's subtype 1. Subtype 2 is what we see with a lot of students who have dyslexia. That dyslexia spills over into the world of writing as well by wreaking havoc on their spelling. So we have a couple of different spelling tests and ways to present spelling that looks to see, we call it the dysgraphic index. To what extent is your dyslexia also hindering your writing? Your core problem is dyslexia, but quite natural, if you cannot sequence sounds, cannot read and decode by stitching together sounds, you're going to struggle to do it when you spell as well. So we have sort of this spelling index based on your dyslexia. But the third subtype and the most common is called executive dysgraphia. And those are the kids who, in a classroom discussion in school, they have a lot to say. There's a lot of knowledge. There's on a particular subject. The problem is getting it from here down to the paper. Then they go down to writer's workshop. They're supposed to write about 20 minutes, and they barely get a sentence down, and everyone thinks they're lazy, they're not trying. Basically, they don't know how to get started. They don't know how to
Yeah.
self-organize the information. So we look at aspects of executive functioning, whether that is retrieval, or maybe you can retrieve the information, but working memory, you have to hold that information for a long period of time. I mean, get it out through paper and pencil transcription. What a slow output that is. Maybe it's an inability to sequence and syntactically arrange the information. So this all fits under this umbrella that we call executive dysgraphia that can be summed up in 2 words: poor elaboration. You just don't get very much down on paper. You got a lot more up here.
Yeah.
You run into a few students or a few hundred like this, Adrian, they've got the knowledge, you just can't get it down on paper. And what they do get is a complete disaster.
Yes. Oh, I love that. And I think that runs deep in my family. My husband, you should see him. He's a civil engineer. He had no idea that civil engineers would write so much. He thought, I could just get to use this to make beautiful roadways and parks and cool stuff. But he does a tremendous amount of writing, and it is so labor intensive. It takes a lot of effort to get what's up here down on paper. I struggle with that too. And so that's really interesting. I'm so excited to learn more about that assessment. And I think
That might be our next. We'll have to do a part 2 of this and talk writing.
yeah, we should. I think that would be amazing. So you have shown several times that you say no when someone proposes something. No, I don't want to do that. So I'm curious, what assessments are next for you? What has people asked you to do next that you're curious about, or what are you developing next?
Well, we have 2 assessments currently in the works. One is we're developing the FAR, our reading test for Spanish speakers.
Oh,
And
cool.
it's not going to be a translation of the FAR because the FAR was designed to pick up the nuances of the English language, which we refer to as an opaque language. There's many words that are irregular and offbeat spellings and that kind of thing. Whereas Spanish is much more of a transparent language. Kind of what you see is what you get.
Mhm.
Each letter makes the same sound in most words. So it took a life of its own in a way, and we have unique subtests dedicated to the Spanish language to look at dyslexia for our English language learners. So we're in the process of norming that. Of course, because of the pandemic, it was very hard to norm any
Yeah,
instruments when
I
students were in
bet.
school. Um, and then we also currently working on a checklist called the FACT, and that is a rating scale that's looking at childhood trauma, and that is currently
Mm,
being developed. Not so much the source of trauma, but for educators, we're just going to assume some trauma was in the life of this child. The goal of the test is not, or the scale is not to say, well, what kind of abuse was it or neglect. That's not what it's about. It's how does this impact us in an educational setting from
mm.
an emotional standpoint, a behavioral standpoint, a physiology type of standpoint, an academic standpoint. And it also has a resiliency scale in there as well. One of the items, measures I still would like to work on, and I'll ask you, Adrian,
Mhm.
in your work, is a checklist to go along with the FAM that solely looks at math anxiety. And my
Yes.
question is, the kids you work with, how many of them do you find are intimidated and just freaked out about math as much as they have some sort of learning disability?
So many of them. In fact, we had to drastically change the way we assess where they are, like where they are in the continuum of learning math, because we would get these kids who are so freaked out. I mean, total freeze or flight. We would have kids darting from their computer. They would be going along just fine in the assessment and then reach something that completely freaks them out and they would run away, or try to hide or throw a blanket over their camera. Like the behaviors were interesting to say the least, to try to get away from that assessment stimulus. So we changed it drastically to game based. And so they play games because that lowers the anxiety. And then we can really look at what do they know. And if they miss the concept, like let's say it's a problem 3 times in a row, that type of problem, we stop right there and say, okay, that's where we're going to start is right here. with this kiddo, because if we keep beating them over the head with things they can't do, they're just shut down, shut down, shut down. So we changed what we had to do drastically to control for that anxiety, because we didn't feel like we were getting accurate measures of what they actually knew.
So clever to use games in the form of games and activities. I believe the average elementary student receives about 52 minutes of mathematical instruction per day. And I get laughed at for saying this, but I know you won't laugh at me. Outside of recess, that should be your most fun 50 minutes of the entire day.
It really should.
Because of folks like you can present it in a fun way to minimize the anxiety.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what we do. And so our guidance to team members, if that student is extremely anxious, we actually tell them abandon the lesson plan that we have. We have a standardized lesson plan from Dr. Joyce Steves that we use that has a specific flow. And we tell them press pause on that. Instead, you're going to play games and that's it. Because that child is not in a state of mind that they can actually absorb this new content. So we get to play games with these students, and we're building that relationship of trust, showing them that this is not a threatening experience. And then once they've calmed down, we can go to our prescriptive lesson plan and get that student moving. So it's so important. Anxiety is a huge problem. So I would love to see an anxiety checklist get added into that FAM. That would be huge, because that's something that we're talking to parents about, about things they can do at home to help them regulate during their homework time and things like that. Because if they're in a state of anxiety, you're not getting a whole lot accomplished.
No, you're just not in an emotional readiness position to learn, and whatever math, unlike any other subject, seems to bring that angst out, and not just in kids, but in parents.
Mm-hmm.
And if students come home and they're relying on their parents for a little help, but we're doing it a way that wasn't the way they learned when they were in school, we start clashing a little bit.
Yes, the clashes are huge. Yes. And if you're dealing with a middle schooler, we're also dealing with the fact that their frontal lobes are under construction. They're not super good at reading facial expressions. And so your frustration with how it's being taught could be perceived as you're mad at your child when you're not. And so there's so much that's going on. So yeah, like keeping that anxiety down is key if you're going to be helping with homework on both sides, for both of you trying to be as regulated as possible.
Sounds like half of your job is to be a therapist for the child to
It
calm
is.
them down, and then we can introduce the instruction.
Yes, absolutely. While our job, the work we do, is extremely rewarding, it is exhausting. My team talks about that a few of them were thinking like, maybe I could do full time, but what they discover is it is exhausting. That teacher is very tired at the end of the week, because they're playing therapist, they're playing researcher, investigator. They're trying to get into that child's mind and figure out how they're perceiving this so that they can come in and support and give the right help at the right time. It's exhausting, but very rewarding when we get it right.
Very rewarding, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I've had so much fun with you. I could keep going. I have a feeling we could talk all day about all of these things. But as you know, we love to end with jokes. And you said you had one that you would love to share your screen and show with us. If you want to take a minute and grab it, I would love to.
All right, bear with my technology issues. Let's see if we can't get this up. Let's go here. And so one of the questions you asked me earlier, can you see my screen okay?
I see it.
Adrianne?
Yeah.
Why did you come up with the instrument in the first place? What were some of the challenges in developing the FAM? Some of the challenges in developing an instrument, we have a whole team of researchers. Yes, my name is on the instrument, a whole team of researchers that come up, brainstorm, we try to come up with, the most innovative ways possible to get it and craft such a test with good validity and good reliability. And it takes one 7-year-old just to shoot us down, because you can never predict the answers you might get. Here are some answers that we got. Are you ready?
Yeah, so let's see it.
Actual test questions. What ended in 1896? 1895. Okay, clever. That's real funny.
Very
You like this?
clever.
You like this one, Adrian? Name the quadrilateral. Okay, Bob, Sam, Kate, Harry. Yeah, clever, clever. I did that. All right, you want a little? Here's a middle school answer. Are you ready?
Let's see it.
Peter, expanded notation. It gets wider and wider and wider. It's expanding.
It is
Good job.
expanding. I love the teacher's comment. Very funny.
Yeah, very funny, Peter. Yeah. You can only just visualize what this kid is like. All right, we're learning algebra and solve for x. He made it 6 equals 6. Okay.
I like it.
I guess here's some of my favorites. Find x. Right there. Adrian, I found it. It's right there.
It's right there. What are you talking about?
Absolutely. So do we have one or two more here? How do you change centimeters to meters? Take out the centi. So you start getting responses like that and you realize, my gosh, look at the challenge I have in front of me. But it gives you a window of how kids conceptualize math a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things all of our team enjoys the most about working with these kids. You never know what they're going to say.
No.
So fun. This was so much fun. We'll have to have you back and we'll talk about all the other fun assessments you're doing. And I really appreciate you shedding the light about all the people that go into making these assessments. It's not a one-man show. And thank you for shedding the light on all the amazing people around you. And where can we tell people to go to learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, I do not have a great social media presence, but my publisher is PAR, P-A-R. All of our assessment instruments are published by PAR, and you can read up, get a brief description about them, and again, they're all more diagnostic assessment instruments. Not so much concerned where you are with the skill, but why you're there. And yeah, so thank you so much, Adrian, for having me, and also a big thank you for the work that you and your team do. I might be part one of the equation, but you're part two, and your part's probably more important. So thank you.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you for saying that. All right, Steven, we'll let you go. Have a really great day.